Hey, sports card fans, it's John Wade Boggs fan. Hope you're all doing well. Recently, James Elite Hunters and Saul BD Kane had a lengthy discussion in which they talked about why some people love collecting vintage cards and why some people love collecting modern cards. Now, James is on the vintage side of the discussion, although he is working on a 2011 top set with all the different parallels and subsets, but I believe the majority of his collection is vintage. And I think for Saul, I think he's mainly into modern cards. And to be fair, I'm really on both sides of the discussion. With the modern era considering starting in 1981, all my Wade Boggs cards could be considered modern cards. In fact, every year there are new Wade Boggs cards that get released. So a large part of my collection is collecting modern cards. But for vintage cards, that's always been my passion and my main interest is collecting vintage cards. So I have two reasons why I love collecting vintage cards. The first one is it gives you an opportunity to have playing days cards of some of the all-time greatest baseball players that have ever lived. Their records and accomplishments set the foundation for modern players. So you may have a new player that may be the third fastest to hit 200 career home runs. Well, what are they basing that off of? They're basing that off of the records that all these all-time greats have set. All the records and accomplishments, all the feats that these all-time great players, the modern players are put against or compared to. And some of the records and accomplishments of the all-time greats may never be broken. I don't know if anyone is going to break Joe DiMaggio's 56-game consecutive hitting streak. I don't know if any modern player is ever going to hit 400 in a season like Ted Williams did in 1941. And I don't think there's ever going to be a modern pitcher that is going to have at least 300 wins in their career. So to be able to collect cards from these players that set the foundation for greatness in the sport of baseball, I find interesting and appealing. And to have some of these playing days cards of some of the all-time greats in my collection is what I shoot for. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that I'm not sure how to put this, but it harkens back to a simpler time, and I don't want to necessarily say in the hobby, but in terms of just collecting cards. Vintage cards are reminiscent of a more simpler time. I'm old enough to have started collecting right at the end of the vintage period. I started buying packs of cards in 1978, and most people consider the vintage era going up through 1980. And back then, I played with my cards. There were no top loaders, penny sleeves. There was no grading. I had cards and maybe traded with friends and just enjoyed the cards. In fact, I used to flip cards, and the way that I flipped cards with some of my friends is we would have a sort of a line along the wall, and we'd hold the card up against the wall and let go, and the card would flip down on the floor. And the next one to flip, if you landed on any cards, you got to pick up those cards. In fact, my mom actually had baseball cards back in the early to mid 50s, and she explained that she would get together with some of the kids in the neighborhood and set the cards up on an angle along the garage door, stand so far away back from the garage door, and flip the cards. And if you knocked over any of the cards, though, you got to keep the cards. And so kids didn't worry about the condition of the cards. They stored their cards in a shoebox. They didn't assign any value to the cards, as opposed to today, where, you see it all over YouTube, where people open up a pack of cards. Heck, sometimes they even wear gloves because they don't want their fingers to mark up the glossy, shiny coating, because they want to submit the card into PSA to hope to get a PSA 10. They'll handle the cards with a kid glove, immediately put it in that penny sleeve in a top loader. For vintage cards, you could open up a pack back in the day and every single card could be way off center, and kids didn't care. It wasn't about condition. You just wanted to maybe get some cards of your favorite players and maybe trade with some of your friends. There were no big national shows. You'd be lucky if you had any type of local card shop. You basically bought cards at a store and maybe traded with your friends and maybe tried to build a set or maybe collect all the players of your favorite team. It was just a more simpler time. In fact, when I do some of my top 10 eBay sales videos, and I see some of these vintage cards in really high grade condition, my first gut instinct is they don't look right. There shouldn't be a card that's 60 years old that looks fresh from a pack. I know they do exist out there, but they're the exception rather than the rule. That's why I love collecting vintage cards that have some love to them. Now, granted, I do search for well-centered cards, and that's another sort of challenge in collecting vintage cards, is to try to find those cards that are well-centered. The printing technology back then was not even close to what it is today. Some people get all up in arms if they open up a brand new pack of cards and heaven forbid the big hit in the pack is just slightly off center and they're not going to get a 10. They get all upset and, how can Topps do this? Their quality control is terrible. Every single card out of a pack should be a 10. It's all about grade. It's all about value. Now, we can't get around value and pricing in today's hobby. It is what it is. But with vintage cards, it reminds me of a simpler time where kids would buy a pack of cards, maybe with some gum in it, or if you go way back, some caramel, but primarily gum. And they got to see whether they could get some of their favorite players that maybe they hear on the radio or in later periods maybe see on TV or at the ballpark. And so collecting vintage, it sort of bases me. I guess you could say, maybe that's not the right word, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying is, when I look at a vintage card, there's a history to it. You see a card that may have some creases or a wrinkle or some dinged corners, and you think, who had this card? Who pulled this card from a pack? How long did they have it in their collection before they sold it off to someone? How many times has this card changed hands? How did it get all those, wrinkles and creases in it? You can tell some of these cards were loved and not immediately put behind plastic and preserved. Now, again, I do collect graded vintage cards. Now, there's a whole other reason why I collect graded cards, but I still go back to the simpler times that vintage cards remind me of, and that's why I love collecting vintage baseball cards so much. So, James, I hope that works for the video response. I hope I conveyed, I know I'm just doing some of the stuff off the cuff here. It's hard to sometimes put sort of feelings and emotions into words as to why you enjoy doing something. So I hope you understand where I'm coming from. I'd love to know in the comments whether you agree with my reasoning or whether you have other reasons why you may enjoy collecting vintage versus modern cards. And with that, that's all I have for you. So until next time, thanks for watching.